Hey guys, tonight we're plunging headfirst into the velvet-curtained, hay-strewn, rule-laden world of medieval intimacy. You've heard the fairy tales knights, castles, forbidden kisses, but beneath the romantic gloss was a society deeply confused, often hilarious, and sometimes just plain weird about sex. Imagine trying to flirt without emojis, propose marriage after one poem, or prove your virginity in front of a crowd. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from, so drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in the narrow alleys of a medieval town, shoes crunching over muddy cobblestones, as church bells toll and market stalls creak in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a girl drops a woven ribbon on purpose, strategically, slowly. A boy pauses, picks it up. No one says a word. But this tiny act just launched the opening move in a complicated courtship game. In medieval times, romance was a performance, and you, dear listener, would be center stage. There was no Tinder, no letters sealed with hearts, just social codes, family expectations, and long pauses pregnant with symbolism. Courting was public, very public. Entire families watched from balconies as young nobles paraded beneath their windows, hoping to catch a glance or a favor glove tossed, a song sung, or, if you were lucky, a faint smile. Mainstream historical fact? Most medieval marriages were arranged especially among nobility. Love came after marriage, if it came at all. But still, people craved connection. Among peasants, who had a bit more leeway, love matches happened more frequently. But even then, the church and community had opinions, loud ones. You'd probably find it frustrating to show affection without words, to hint at attraction by tying coloured threads into sleeves or exchanging flowers that all had bizarre meanings. Red roses for passion, nopetry basil for hate, fennel for flattery, or rosemary for remembrance. Historians still argue whether these symbolic gestures were widely understood or just folklore patched together later. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some parts of Europe, there was a tradition called bundling. Imagine this: you're lying in bed, fully clothed, next to your potential partner, wrapped in separate blankets, sometimes even with a literal wooden board between you. The idea? You could talk all night, but no touching. Parents approved. Candles flickered. And temptation flickered too. One town in Wales took it even further. They wrapped the girl in a bundling sack. Think a medieval sleeping bag, sewed it shut. If the guy could keep things chaste all night, potential husband material. If not, well, it was sometimes used because the couple had already been intimate, and this was a formal step toward engagement. Ah yes, nothing says romance like being sewn into a sack. Meanwhile, troubadours wandered the streets, singing exaggerated ballads of love and heartbreak, often addressed to married noblewomen. These women were idolized, but rarely touched. Courtly love, as it's known, was a bit of a medieval fantasy, men pining for unattainable women, writing tortured poetry, and fainting a lot. Realistic? Not really. Entertaining? Very. But back to your role maybe. You're a young squire, mustering the courage to ask the miller's daughter to the village dance. You fix your tunic, brush straw from your hair, and approach. No pickup lines allowed. Instead, you compliment her embroidery. She blushes and offers you a ribbon. Boom, you're halfway to marriage. However, don't get too excited. You'll need approval from parents, clergy, maybe the whole town council. Premarital relations could land you in the stocks. Or worse, an unwanted pregnancy and public shaming. Still, people found ways. Haylofts had more secrets than the king's treasury. And speaking of public, let's not forget the charivari. If your courtship was too scandalous, or your marriage controversial, say, you were widowed and remarried too quickly, the village might show up outside your home banging pots and pans, singing rude songs, and mocking you until you offered them booze or left town. It was the medieval version of online shaming, but louder and with cowbells. Interestingly, some scholars believe all this performative romance was less about love and more about managing property, alliances, and childbirth. But others argue that people always found a way to love and laugh, sometimes through cracks in the strictest rules. Like the knight who composed sonnets for a nun, or the peasant who pretended to be mute just to sneak into the maid's quarters undetected. Spoiler, he was eventually found out mid-sentence. So here you are, walking back from the village fete, ribbon in hand, wondering what her smile meant. No one tells you directly. Instead, love hides in coded glances, the smell of summer flowers, and the gentle graze of hands during a communal harvest. You glance back once, just in case she's watching. She is. And just like that, in a world with no electricity, no privacy, and no idea how to spell romantic, something flicker soft, shy, and very human. So, you think you're in love. You've passed the ribbon stage, maybe even shared a chaste moment beneath a pear tree symbol of fertility, by the way, which people in your village definitely noticed. But before things get any steamier, you've got a whole new medieval hurdle to clear. Virginity, the most overhyped, poorly understood, and strangely tested concept in your entire society. It's not just a virtue, it's practically a currency. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was tied to political alliances and land negotiations. Marrying off a non-virgin? Scandalous. If you're a noblewoman, your virginity is documented, gossiped about, and quite possibly inspected before and after the wedding night. You're suddenly less of a person and more of a living lockbox for your father's honor. Mainstream historical fact? Medieval medical texts described virginity as a physical seal, an unbroken hymen, supposedly always present and proof, positive of chastity, which, as modern medicine knows, is biologically inaccurate. But that didn't stop entire communities from believing in and even trying to test that fragile little myth. Quirky tidbit time. Some brides were expected to undergo a virginity trial, which could involve anything from bathing rituals with female witnesses to, disturbingly, post-wedding bed inspections. Yet bloody sheets paraded around as proof of virtue. No pressure, right? Especially when you're also supposed to stay calm, delicate, and possibly sing a hymn while being deflowered in a freezing stone room with your mother-in-law banging on the door. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or more localized to elite and royal circles, but the obsession was very real. So real, in fact, that entire professions sprang up to preserve, fake, or even restore. Virginity midwives knew tricks involving chicken blood, crushed beetles, or even sleight of hand with red cloth tucked beneath the sheets. Medieval magic, folks. And the double standards? Absolutely medieval. A man could arrive at his wedding night with a brothel stamp card and still be praised for his virility. But a woman? One wrong rumour, and she's unfit for marriage, or worse, is suspected of sorcery. Why witchcraft, you ask? Because according to some clerics, a woman who lusted outside of wedlock might be hosting a demon, and you thought dating apps were harsh. You, lying there on your straw mattress, might wonder what your partner's been told. Likely, it's a mix of frightening sermons and euphemisms. Medieval sex education washo, shall we say this lacking. Most young people learned the facts of life via animals, folklore, or extremely confusing religious metaphors, like, the plough must know the soil, or the vessel must be opened with prayer. Not exactly helpful when you're nervous, 17, and holding a candle stub for lighting. Want another awkward medieval moment? In some regions, especially in royal circles, there was the witnessed bedding. This meant that after the wedding feast, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber by family and clergy, blessed, and sometimes even undressed by attendants. Then, everyone stayed to watch the start of consummation, just to make sure it happened. No pressure. Good luck. And it didn't stop there. In France, certain legal disputes around annulment relied on detailed physical descriptions. Courts might call for evidence that the marriage had not been fulfilled, and send physicians or priests to investigate. Super romantic, right? Meanwhile, if you're a young woman in a small village, you might face a different version of this pressure. The gossips at the communal well watch who you walk home with. If your ankle is showing, someone's great-aunt clutches her pearls. If you're pregnant before the wedding, the whole town knows before you do, and the local priest is already preparing your punishment. Some women, faced with shame, would claim divine intervention. There are documented cases of girls saying an angel made them pregnant. One even claimed she became pregnant after drinking from a stream where a man had bathed. Historians still debate whether these stories were strategic defenses or deeply held folk beliefs that blurred nature and miracle. But not everyone accepted the shame. Some women embraced their sexuality with defiance. There's a record of one noblewoman who insisted she would only marry a man who could solve 3 riddles sexual in nature, of course, and she refused every suitor who failed. She died single. Or maybe she just died happy. So now, let's say you and your beloved are married. You're in your shared home, a wooden hut with poor insulation, nosy neighbours, and a goat that never stops bleating. That first night, it might feel more like a performance than a private moment. But beneath the stress, fear, and candle smoke, there's also something gentle, maybe laughter, maybe clumsy kindness. Maybe 2 people figuring out something ancient and tender in a world that never quite let them talk about it. You glance out the tiny window and spot the moonlight on the thatched roofs. Somewhere, a bard sings about love that conquers kings and curses. You lean in closer not because you must, but because you want to. The myths fall away. Just for a moment, you forget the rules. You've made it through the pageantry of courtship and the suffocating expectations of purity. Now comes something a little more grounded, literally. Because while stories love to place medieval lovers atop silken beds in moonlit towers, most real intimacy happened far from the romance novels you never had access to in the first place. Let's talk about where people actually had sex in the Middle Ages. You probably imagine a big 4-poster bed, velvet curtains swaying in a candlelit breeze, maybe a lute playing softly in the corner. But unless you were a noble-like, top-tier noble, your reality was a bit more drafty. You're more likely curled up in a straw-stuffed mattress on the dirt floor, sharing a room with your children, your livestock, and possibly your in-laws. Mainstream historical fact. Most medieval homes, especially for peasants, had just one room. That's it. Kitchen, living space, bedroom, all the same cramped wooden box. Privacy? Absolutely non-existent. If you wanted alone time with your spouse, you had to wait for everyone to fall asleep, or maybe sneak out to the barn. Nothing says romance like trying not to wake the pig. But even among the upper classes, things weren't as elegant as the tapestries suggest. Sure, nobles had actual bedrooms, sometimes even private chambers with doors. Ooh, luxury. But they were rarely alone. Servants slept nearby, maids came and went, and if you were a king or queen, you were basically on display 24/7. Some royal couples were expected to perform their consummation in the presence of witnesses, doctors, priests, and very awkward uncles just to confirm the marriage was legally binding. Still, some spaces were designed to spark intimacy. In wealthier homes, the sola was a private upper room used by the family. It offered warmth, light, and relative privacy. It was the closest thing to a romantic sanctuary you could get until your toddler wandered in asking for porridge. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some towns had designated love gardens. No, seriously. Enclosed, quiet, flower-filled spaces where couples could escape the watchful eyes of their elders and whisper sweet nothings of plot escape routes. Historians still argue whether these gardens were official or just poetic devices in troubadour songs, but archaeological digs have revealed enclosed green spaces that suggest they weren't entirely mythical. And what about the bed itself? Well, if you were lucky enough to have one, it was probably made of rope strung across a wooden frame, supporting a hay-stuffed mattress, which, by the way, had to be tightened regularly, hence the phrase, sleep tight. Some beds had curtains, not for luxury, but to block the cold and provide some illusion of privacy. You could also pull the bed out from under a loft or shelf, like a giant medieval trundle. Let's say you're a newly married peasant. Your first night is quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers. You've managed to find a bit of time after your relatives have dozed off. Your mattress rustles, your sheep grumbles in the corner, and you hope desperately that the squeaky floorboards don't wake the baby. Is it romantic? Sort of. In a rugged, resourceful way. Intimacy wasn't about atmosphere, it was about making the best of what you had. For many, sex was tied to survival, securing heirs, solidifying bonds, and sometimes just staying warm. Now imagine being in a travelling caravan, merchants or pilgrims on the road. Nights were spent crammed into wagons, huddled under cloaks, or sleeping in roadside inns that were basically glorified barns. Yet even in these rough settings, humans still found moments to connect. It's amazing, really, how desire persists through mud, cold, and snoring companions. Interestingly, clergy often weighed in on bedroom arrangements. Certain church leaders believed couples should sleep in separate beds to maintain purity outside of procreation. Others insisted that marital sex, even for pleasure, was acceptable as long as it was within the bounds of wedlock and decently timed. No Tuesdays before Mass, no Sundays at all, definitely not during Lent. And yes, that was actually enforced in some regions. Another delightful myth, the sinful bed positions. The missionary position was usually deemed acceptable, predictably called the natural way, but anything else was suspect. From behind, animalistic. On top as a woman, scandalous. Sideways, sorcery. Historians still debate whether these rules were commonly followed, or just written down by grumpy monks with way too much time on their hands. But let's not pretend all encounters were consensual or tender. Marital rape wasn't legally recognized. A woman's consent, once married, was assumed to be permanent. And lower-class women, especially servants, were extremely vulnerable to exploitation by their employers. It's a painful truth, though, that deserves acknowledgement in any honest look at medieval intimacy. Yet in the quiet corners of history, we also see love stories that transcend the mud and monotony, letters between spouses separated by war, songs composed for absent lovers, a knight carving his beloved's name into his sword hilt, and peasants exhausted from the harvest sharing a stolen kiss behind the oxen pen, with the moon as their only witness. So as you settle into your own bed, warm and private, consider what it meant to carve out intimacy in a world that rarely gave you space for it. No feather pillows, no Netflix to set the mood. Just two people, surrounded by family, livestock, and obligation, yet somehow still managing to find moments that felt like magic. Now that you've found a little privacy, you can call sharing a bed with bedbugs, goats, and possibly your cousin privacy. Let's talk about the biggest micromanager of medieval sex, the church. You might think the clergy would be too busy running monasteries or copying sacred texts to care about your bedroom choices, but oh no, they had thoughts. Deep, detailed, sometimes wildly uncomfortable thoughts. Mainstream historical fact? The medieval Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life, including when, how, and with whom you were allowed to have sex. It wasn't just a moral guide, it was an enforcer of the very act itself, down to the preferred position and frequency. It was sort of like having a nosy priest in your head, constantly whispering, "Not tonight, it's a holy day." The basic rule was this: sex was okay, but only in marriage, only for procreation, and only in a position that didn't involve creativity. Missionary? Acceptable. Anything else? Questionable, suspicious, possibly demonic. Some theologians claimed that unnatural acts invited the devil into your marriage. Imagine just trying something new and worrying you might summon Satan by mistake. A quirky tidbit? There was actually a literal list of forbidden times for sex, and it was long. No intimacy during Lent, 40 days. Advent, another 40. Sundays, feast days, fast days, the eve of feast days, and certain phases of the moon. Depending on your piety, that left maybe 80 or 90 nights a year where intimacy was technically allowed, and even then, you were supposed to confess it afterward, just in case you enjoyed it too much. Historians still argue whether these rules were enforced across all classes, or mainly among the educated elite. After all, in a small farming village, nobody was checking a church calendar before jumping into a pile of hay, but clerical texts from the period were obsessed with monitoring human desire. One famous confessor's manual even advised priests to ask married couples whether they had ever touched each other in joy. The nerve. And that's just the church being general. Once they got specific, things got strange. Some clergy taught that the woman should never be on top, not because of modesty, but because it reversed the natural order: man above, woman below. There was an actual belief that if a child was conceived in the wrong position, it might be born deformed. Yes, your bedroom choices were blamed for birth defects. No pressure. If you were a particularly devout couple, you might even receive spiritual guidance on how to have holy intimacy. One text advised couples to pray beforehand, remain silent during, and give thanks after. Can you imagine? Lighting a candle, clasping hands, praying solemnly, then trying to get in the mood. Good luck with that. And it didn't stop there. Sex for pleasure was seen as sinful, unless, of course, it was the man experiencing pleasure. Women were expected to be passive participants, there for duty, not desire. A wife who admitted she enjoyed sex might be labelled lascivious, or worse, a temptress, because clearly, a woman with an actual libido must be channeling Eve, not just enjoying being alive. Of course, this created a spiritual paradox. People were told to marry and produce children, but also to fear the very act that would make that possible, and so guilt seeped into even the most loving relationships. Imagine lying beside your spouse after a long day in the fields, sharing a stolen moment, and then worrying that your soul was in peril because you didn't stick strictly to the approved choreography. And then there were the confessions. Priests were trained to ask sometimes in excruciating detail about a couple's behavior. Had they sinned through lust? Had they gazed at one another too long? Had they thought impure thoughts on a feast day? This wasn't spiritual support, it was surveillance. Now, let's say you're a newlywed peasant. The priest knows your wedding was last week. He pulls you aside after Mass, asks how the first nights of marriage are going, and reminds you that Mary is always watching. Which Mary? He doesn't say. Probably all of them. But people are people. Despite all the rules and warnings, the desire for connection real, emotional, and yes, physical kept slipping through the cracks. Medieval poetry is full of innuendo, longing, and cheeky metaphors. One 14th century poem compared a woman's body to a castle besieged, with the suitor's lance seeking entrance. Subtle? Not really, but surprisingly widespread, even among monks who secretly scribbled such verses in the margins of psalters. Sometimes, people just ignored the rules entirely. In one documented case, a village couple was scolded by the bishop for engaging in intimacy during Lent. Their excuse? The sow was in heat, so we were inspired. It didn't fly with the church, but it did make the local records. And, let's be honest, it's probably the most honest response in medieval history. And what about when desire didn't follow the expected script? People with lower libidos were seen as saintly, but those with higher, one especially women, were warned of sliding into moral ruin. One text warned that excessive lust in women could dry the womb and open the gates of hell. Another charming excerpt described desire as a worm of fire that gnawed at the soul. You know, bedtime reading. So here you are, curled under a wool blanket, your partner beside you, both of you wondering whether holding hands after sunset counts as a venial sin. The fire crackles. A breeze lifts the curtain. And in the hush, you remember what the old women whisper by the well. What the church forbids by day, the heart reclaims by night. If you're thinking this whole medieval intimacy business sounds like a minefield of guilt and goat interruptions, just wait until you hear what people did when they didn't want the act to lead to its most obvious result, children. Because now we step into a subject that was both whispered about behind closed doors and loudly condemned from the pulpit: birth control. Mainstream historical fact. Despite what many believe, medieval people absolutely did try to prevent pregnancy. They weren't clueless. They just didn't have latex, science-based methods, or Google. What they did have was a curious mix of herbal remedies, folk magic, superstition, and sheer wishful thinking. Let's say you're a peasant woman who already has 6 children and can barely feed them. You're desperate not to conceive again. So what are your options? Well, you might try chewing on pennyroyal leaves, a common medieval herb believed to suppress conception. Or you might brew a tea from wild carrot seeds, also known as Queen Anne's lace. The catch? Both were toxic in large amounts, and worked as often as they didn't. Take too little, and nothing changes. Take too much, and you might not wake up. Quirky tidbit. Some women wore amulets made of weasel bones around their necks or tied dried beaver testicles to their thighs. No, really. The idea was that the animal's fertility could somehow be absorbed or repelled through magical proximity. No actual science here, just medieval vibes. Meanwhile, the church's stance was crystal clear. Contraception of any kind was considered a sin. Life was sacred, and interfering with its creation was seen as a rejection of God's will. Condoms, even when they appeared in the later Middle Ages, often made from animal intestines or linen soaked in chemicals, were mostly used to prevent disease, not pregnancy. Even then, their use was controversial and mostly underground. Historians still argue whether midwives, who often served as the quiet keepers of women's health, routinely offered contraceptive advice. Some believe they shared recipes for herbal preparations passed down orally for generations. Others think the church's crackdown on witchcraft wiped out much of this ancient knowledge, especially as midwives were increasingly seen as suspicious figures in a male-dominated medical world. And what about abstinence? Technically, it was the only church-approved method of birth control. Practically, it was a gamble. One too many flagons of ale at the midsummer feast, and next thing you know, another child is on the way. And if you think medieval men were paragons of self-control, consider this. One 13th century medical manual suggested that men who didn't release their humours regularly risked swelling, madness, or even death. So yes, apparently lust could be fatal. For couples who were particularly desperate, more extreme methods were sometimes attempted. One manuscript described a practice where women placed pieces of dried camel dung in their vaginas before intercourse. No one knows how that was supposed to help, but historians agree it was not great and likely very uncomfortable. But by far, the most reliable method? Breastfeeding. Extended nursing was known to delay fertility, and some women used it as a natural form of spacing between pregnancies. In fact, noble families sometimes hired wet nurses, partly so noble women could return to conceiving quickly, while peasant women nursed longer, and perhaps unknowingly, gained some biological protection. Still, despite all efforts, unwanted pregnancies happened. And what then? The options were bleak. Abortion was a deeply taboo subject, but some desperate women sought it out. There are scattered records of potion sellers, or wise women, offering herbal mixtures meant to bring on miscarriages. These mixtures were risky, often toxic, and always condemned. If discovered, both the practitioner and the woman might face punishment or worse, accusations of witchcraft. And then there's infanticide, a heartbreaking last resort in a society with almost no social safety nets. Some desperate mothers abandoned infants at churches, hoping the local abbey would take them in. Others weren't so lucky. There were harsh penalties for this, and many medieval cities established foundling wheels, rotating wooden cradles set into the walls of monasteries. A mother could place her baby in the wheel and turn it anonymously, saving the child while avoiding exposure herself. You lie back on your lumpy straw mattress and consider what people were willing to do just to reclaim a bit of control over their bodies and their futures. The candle flickers low. Somewhere beyond the shutters, a dog howls. You think of the village midwife, bent-backed and quiet, her apothecary cabinet full of secrets. And yet, through it all, couples still found ways to be tender, silly, hopeful. A husband might gift his wife a necklace made from fennel and rue both believed to ward off conception. A wife might mix wild herbs into stew, hoping he wouldn't notice. They loved each other, feared the future, and tried their best with what little they knew. Because deep down, even when they didn't have the right tools or permission, people wanted the same things they do now: connection, safety, and a say in their own lives. Let's step quietly into the shadows now, the places people didn't talk about, at least not loudly. You've heard the rules of courtship, the burden of purity, the tangled mess of birth control. But what if your desires didn't fit the mold at all? What if, in a world that praised procreation and punished deviation, your heart leaned towards someone of the same sex? Mainstream historical fact: same-sex relationships absolutely existed in medieval Europe, but the way they were seen, spoken of, or silenced was wildly inconsistent, ranging from toleration in certain times and places to brutal persecution in others. The records we have are often fragmented, coded, or filtered through the language of law, church doctrine, or poetry designed to hide more than it revealed. You, perhaps, are a young apprentice in a cathedral town. You've noticed another boy in the stonemasons' guild. You trade glances during Mass. You laugh too long at his jokes. There's a warmth in your chest you can't explain, but you also know to keep your voice down, your smile brief, your hope hidden. Historians still argue whether the intense male friendships of the period were purely platonic or romantically charged. Letters between men, especially nobles or monks, often use language we'd now find deeply affectionate, even intimate. Phrases like, "I long for your embrace," or "my heart aches in your absence," appear in medieval correspondence, yet were, at the time, not necessarily viewed through a modern lens of sexual identity. But then there are the court records, brutal, unambiguous. In 14th century London, men accused of sodomy could be tortured, castrated, or burned. Some cities had entire inquisitorial offices dedicated to investigating unnatural vice. Punishment depended on your class, your connections, and the discretion of those in power. Peasants might be whipped and exiled. Nobles might be quietly warned or publicly executed, if politically convenient. And yet, the human heart doesn't vanish under pressure. In monastery records, scholars have found poems passed secretly between monks. In one especially telling fragment, a monk describes dreaming of a fellow brother and waking troubled, yet blessed. The language is delicate, filled with metaphor, but the ache is unmistakable. Let's not forget women. Female same-sex relationships were less frequently prosecuted, not because they were accepted, but because male authorities often didn't take them seriously or even imagine them possible. When two women were discovered in a romantic or sexual relationship, they could be charged with heresy or witchcraft. In one infamous case from the Low Countries, a woman was burned for living as a man and loving as one. Her crime? Wearing male clothes and marrying another woman under a false name. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts claimed that women who were too sexually active with each other could develop enlarged organs and become more masculine. It was a bizarre attempt to explain what they refused to understand, and it reveals how little separation there was between science, superstition, and fear. Despite the risks, coded communities likely existed. Some scholars suggest that urban centers like Venice, Paris, or certain German cities offered more anonymity, allowing individuals to form subtle networks of mutual recognition, a shared glance, a knowing phrase, an inn where certain confirmed bachelors always seemed to stay. Was it safe? Not exactly, but it was something. And sometimes something was everything. Even the literature of the time hints at hidden truths. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, one character, a Pardoneris, described with ambiguous features and a suspiciously close relationship with another man. Is it satire? Subtext? The scholars still debate it, but it's a glimmer in the text, a wink from across the centuries. You rest your head on your pillow, soft from years of use, and imagine a world where your feelings aren't a crime. You picture two boys meeting by the riverbank at dusk, exchanging carved trinkets. Two girls brushing each other's hair in the corner of a convent dormitory, their hands lingering just a moment too long. The past didn't lack love, it just buried it. And perhaps the deepest truth of all, medieval society feared same-sex love not just because it was unnatural, but because it revealed something they couldn't control: intimacy without purpose. Love not tied to land, inheritance, or childbirth. Love for its own sake. That was the real threat, and that's what survived. By now, you've probably noticed that medieval love came with conditions, expectations, watchful eyes. But no chapter in this old tale of intimacy is quite as messier, surprisingly inventive, the one about cheating, chastity belts, and scandal. Because, as much as medieval society tried to enforce purity, virtue, and monogamy, humans have always been messy, curious, and often just plain tempted. Mainstream historical fact? Adultery was technically illegal across most of medieval Europe, especially for women. A straying wife could face severe penalties, ranging from public humiliation to outright exile. Her husband? Often a slap on the wrist, or less, depending on his rank. That's right, medieval double standards could win awards. So, let's say you're a miller's wife, and your husband is frequently away at market. You've caught the attention of the local reeve. A shared smile at the well becomes a stolen touch behind the granary. You know the risks, but in a world where your value is tied to obedience, being seen, desired, and pursued feels like its own form of rebellion. Of course, not everyone took such risks willingly. Many affairs were forced, manipulated, or hidden under complex layers of power, and when discovered, the consequences were wildly uneven. A nobleman caught with another man's wife might be fined or asked to apologize at court. A woman, dragged through the streets in a shift, hair cut off, with dung thrown at her by neighbors. There were even cases where accused adulteresses had to ride backwards on a donkey through town, while holding a dead fish symbolism layered with insult. Quirky tidbit. This is where the infamous chastity belt myth comes in. Popular belief holds that men locked their wives into iron contraptions before heading off to the Crusades, keys around their necks or hidden in scrolls. But here's the twist: historians largely agree that chastity belts were more legend than reality. Most physical examples we have were made centuries later, often for museum curiosity or satire. They were the medieval equivalent of tabloid exaggeration. Still, the idea had staying power. It reflected a deep anxiety, mainly male anxiety about control, lineage, and sexual access. Men feared being made cuckolds, especially when property and inheritance were involved. Some even demanded virginity oaths, or sought to prove their wives' faithfulness through bizarre rituals. One German noble allegedly made his wife sleep with a consecrated relic under her pillow every night, as a kind of moral alarm system. No word on whether it beeped. Historians still argue whether this obsession with fidelity was more about love or power. After all, a woman's pregnancy had implications far beyond the household. An illegitimate child could cause a bloodline dispute, ruin alliances, or cost someone their claim to a castle. So jealousy, in medieval times, wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. But scandal wasn't limited to the bedroom. Entire court dramas unfolded around affairs. Queen Marguerite of Burgundy, for instance, was imprisoned for adultery in a tower for the rest of her life. And her lovers? Executed. Swiftly, publicly, messily. Royal gossip travelled fast, and people devoured it just like they do today, only without smartphones or hashtags. Even the church wasn't immune. Monks and nuns were frequently caught in quiet dalliances. Some monasteries tried to prevent this by separating male and female buildings by rivers, moats, or hedgerows. Others took it further. One abbey built its women's dormitory on stilts in the middle of a fish pond. Nothing says, "No boys allowed," like surrounding your room with eels. So let's return to you. Maybe you're a young wife in a quiet town, bored and unfulfilled. Maybe your husband is kind but distant, or cruel and controlling. You're trapped in a life you didn't choose, watching your youth slip past like a slow stream. Then someone sees you, not just sees you, but knows you. A travelling bard, a childhood friend returned, a merchant with too much charm and too few morals. What happens next? Maybe you resist. Maybe you write secret letters. Maybe, one night, you take a risk. Because love, in any age, is hungry. And in a world where everything about your life is dictated, your dress, your chores, your fertility, this might be your only decision that feels like your own. Of course, someone always finds out. The baker's wife saw you near the well. The servant girl heard footsteps in the loft. The priest notices your distracted prayers. Whispers spread like smoke. Suddenly, your name is on every tongue. Not as a person, but a warning. Still, not all tales ended in ruin. Some scandals led to escape, reinvention, even love. A knight and a married lady fleeing to Normandy. Two peasants exiled from their village, only to settle quietly in the next one over, passing as siblings but living together until old age. The records fade, but the feelings don't. Because even in a world of laws and locks, the human heart kept unlocking doors. So, you've heard the church sermons, survived awkward bedding rituals, and maybe even dodged a chastity belt or two. But what if Louvre, at least something like it, came not from poems and proposals, but from a coin discreetly exchanged beneath a cloak in a dark alleyway? Welcome to the complicated, contradictory, and surprisingly structured world of medieval prostitution. Mainstream historical fact: prostitution in the Middle Ages was not only common, it was, in many places, legally tolerated, taxed, and regulated by local authorities. Yes, in a society that frowned on even married couples enjoying themselves too much, you could still find government-run brothels. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where hypocrisy came standard with the bread and ale. Let's say you're a traveller. You've walked all day, your boots soaked, your back aching, and your purse light. As you reach the town gates, you pass a red-tiled building near the outskirts, its shutters painted discreetly, its doorway guarded by a matronly woman with a ledger. This isn't some shady Deniz's an official brothel, licensed by the city council. And yes, she keeps receipts. In fact, some towns saw brothels as a necessary evil, a way to contain male lust and keep the streets orderly. By legalizing and taxing the practice, they could supervise it and, more importantly, profit from it. One 14th century Parisian document details how the city allocated part of its brothel revenue to repair public fountains. So yes, Your night of questionable choices might help someone else get cleaner drinking water. Quirky tidbit: in parts of Germany and France, prostitutes were required by law to wear striped clothing or yellow veils so they could be identified in public. But here's the ironic twist: these markers often made them more fashionable. Nobles started imitating their styles, and the church had to step in again to reassert what modest dress looked like. It's the medieval version of streetwear becoming couture. But while some brothels were clean, well-managed, and even luxurious by the day's standards, the lives of the women inside were rarely safe or easy. Many entered the profession by force sold by families in hard times, orphaned by plague, or seduced by promises that vanished after arrival. Others chose it out of desperation, knowing it was one of the few ways to earn independent income in a society where female labor was rarely respected or well paid. Historians still argue whether some women were able to rise from prostitution into wealth or social mobility. There are stories scattered and rare of courtesans who amassed dowries, married well, or even ran their own establishments. But for most, it was a life filled with risk, disease, violence, exploitation, and constant judgment from the very townspeople who visited them at night. And that's not to mention the church's official stance. Though tolerated in practice, prostitution was still labelled a mortal sin in theory. Clergy preached against the women of Babylon, while quietly blessing the taxes paid by their employers. One bishop famously declared that brothels were like sewers, vile but necessary to keep the city clean. Lovely image. Still, there were moments of humanity. Some brothels maintained rules of respect: no striking the workers, no underage visitors, no services on holy days. A few even required customers to wash beforehand, a rare display of hygiene in an otherwise odor-rich age. The women supported each other, shared remedies, hid one another from abusive clients. In the margins of city records, we find notes about midwives attending to prostitutes, of innkeepers quietly offering protection, of physicians prescribing herbs to treat ailments they dared not name aloud. And then there were the clandestine, sex workers, those who operated outside the official system. Streetwalkers, travelling performers, alehouse girls. Their lives were even riskier. Some carried small talismans said to protect against bad seed. Others worked near pilgrimage sites, where lonely souls sought earthly comfort after praying for heavenly forgiveness. A few were spies, thieves, or informants. Life at the edge of society was often the most dangerous, but also the most free. Now, imagine you're one of these women. Your name isn't written in books. No one will compose a ballad for you. But in the flickering firelight of a rented room, you speak softly to a tired soldier, or bandage the hand of a merchant too proud to admit he's hurt. You offer something that might look like comfort, even if the world refuses to call it that. And yes, there were men too, male sex workers, though less frequently documented. Some catered to women, some to other men. In brothel records from Florence and Venice, we find names, payments, punishments. Their identities were often erased, but their presence lingers like a breath on a cold window pane, hard to see, but undeniably there. Prostitution was medieval society's paradox: vilified yet profitable, hidden yet everywhere. The very people who built cathedrals by day visited brothels by night. Sermons preached purity, while city ledgers recorded income from houses of ill fame. And through it all, the workers themselves survived as best they could, with wit, strength, and a kind of unspoken sisterhood. You lie back now, the candle stub burning low, and picture a quiet street at midnight, footsteps in the fog, a door creaking open. Not judgment, not shame, just two strangers finding warmth in a cold, uncertain world. You've walked the winding alleys of medieval cities, seen the shadowy flicker of red-tiled brothels, and peeked behind the veil of courtly scandal. But there's a darker current running beneath it, alone rooted in fear, suspicion, and the terrible power of accusation. Now, you find yourself in the most terrifying intersection of sex, superstition, and social control, witch hunts, lust, and fear. Mainstream historical fact: between the 14th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft across Europe. While the height of the witch craze came after the Middle Ages, the seeds were sown during this period, and they were often fertilized by suspicions surrounding female sexuality. Imagine being a midwife. You help deliver babies, mix herbs, counsel young women, You're respected but also whispered about. Someone's child dies in the night? Maybe you used the wrong route. A merchant's wife has an affair? Maybe you brewed her a love potion. A nobleman's crops fail? Perhaps you looked at him funny last Thursday. That's all it took. One sideways glance, one angry villager, and suddenly you're hauled before a magistrate with a sack over your head, and the word witch already echoing through the town square. Quirky tidbit. In one Bavarian village, a woman was accused of bewitching a man simply because he had an erection that wouldn't go away. He claimed she had bewitched his member through eye contact. That's right, weaponized glances. Historians still argue whether such cases were primarily about superstition or the criminalization of female agency. Maybe both. The church and secular courts took these accusations seriously, terrifyingly so. Trials involved torture, confessions coerced through agony, and so-called tests that were as absurd as they were cruel. You might be stripped and examined for a witch's mark, a mole, birthmark, or scar, said to be where Satan suckled you, or tossed into a river with your limbs bound. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, and also dead. Great system. Sexuality often lay at the heart of these fears. A woman who spoke too freely, dressed too brightly, or had no husband could be labelled dangerous. If she laughed at the wrong joke, knew how to read, or offered contraceptive advice, she became suspect. The idea of a woman in control of her body was so threatening that society had to reframe her autonomy as evil. Her desire became devilish, her knowledge demonic. There's a chilling consistency to the stories. The accused woman is often poor, unmarried, or simply inconvenient. Her accusers, neighbours, priests, ex-lovers, or even jealous rivals. The charges frequently involved carnal imagery riding broomsticks, a twisted metaphor for masturbation, copulating with demons, or casting love spells. Some confessions, extracted under torture, included vivid tales of orgies at Sabbaths and wild dances under the moon. Were these real beliefs? Delusions? Forced stories told to make the pain stop? Imagine being trapped in that narrative. You, a widow in your 40s, known for tending to sick animals. One evening, you give a teenager a charm to ease her cramps, just herbs sewn into cloth. Days later, she elopes with a farmhand. Her family is furious. They say you cast a love spell. Within hours, a mob is at your door. Even men weren't safe. Certain heretical sects were accused of sodomy and demonic rituals. A male healer who used herbs associated with fertility might be labelled a warlock, but overwhelmingly, it was women who bore the weight. The weaker sex, they claimed, was more easily tempted, lustful, corruptible, convenient scapegoats. It's worth noting that not every region fell into madness. Some city-states rejected the witch craze entirely. A few inquisitors even called out the absurdity of the trials. But in towns where fear took root, it grew quickly and left graveyards in its wake. Meanwhile, art and literature fed the flames. Illustrations from the time depict witches flying naked, casting spells from between their thighs, cavorting with goat-headed demons. The line between lust and witchcraft blurred into one twisted fantasy, mostly authored by celibate men with vivid imaginations and very little real-world experience. And yet, amid this madness, there were quiet resistances, women who sheltered the accused, scholars who wrote counter-arguments, townsfolk who spread stories of kind witches, helpful spirits, protective spells. The same fear that spawned cruelty also sparked rebellion. So here you lie, tucked beneath your blanket, thinking of a woman alone in her cottage, hands stained with herbs, heart full of secrets, not evil, just free. And that freedom, in a world built on control, was her true crime. A chill wind stirs outside. The fire crackles low. Somewhere in the silence, you can almost hear her voice, steady, defiant, whispering through the pages they tried to burn. You've weathered courtship rituals, ducked church guilt, and stood beneath gallows where whispers of witchcraft once hung in the air. But now you're heading straight into the realm of strange potions, mysterious diagrams, and deeply misguided anatomy. Welcome to the curious, often comical, and occasionally horrifying world of medieval bedroom medicinia, place where doctors gave sex advice based on the position of the stars and the consistency of your phlegm. Mainstream historical fact: Medieval medical theory was dominated by the humoral system, the belief that your body was controlled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, including sexual health, depended on keeping these in balance. Feeling lusty? That might mean your hot humors are running wild. Feeling uninterested? Must be too much cold. Moist phlegm. Yes, someone actually got paid to say that. So let's say you're a young nobleman, newly married, but finding the marital bed uninspiring. You consult your physician, who might prescribe a warm bath infused with sage, crushed dates, and powdered stag antler to heat the blood. Then he tells you to sleep with your head facing east, and avoid eating onions unless you want your child to be born with a crooked nose. If you're a woman struggling to conceive, things get weirder. Some doctors believed a woman's womb wandered through her body like a restless ghost. To coax it back into place, treatments included sweet-smelling herbs placed near the lower abdomen and unpleasant ones near the nosetto, lure it downward. Historians still argue whether this wandering womb idea was taken literally or metaphorically, but it definitely showed up in multiple medical texts, usually accompanied by helpful diagrams that looked suspiciously like squid. And then there were the fertility manuals. One famous 13th century guide advised couples on which days to have sex for the best chance at a boy or girl. Want a boy? Try Tuesday. Avoid beans and sleep on your right side. Want a girl? Eat fish and honey and think feminine thoughts. It was medieval logic equal parts, horoscope, kitchen advice, and fan fiction. Quirky tidbit. One prescription for male impotence included boiling a rooster's testicles in wine, adding leeks and goat fat, then drinking the whole concoction under a full moon while chanting Psalm 38. Bonus points if you rubbed the mixture on your thighs beforehand. Did it work? Probably not. Did it make a great story for your barber? Definitely. Now, what about gender roles in the medical realm? Well, women were often viewed as colder and moister, by nature passive, receptive, and more prone to imbalance. They were also believed to be more lustful, since they supposedly needed more friction to generate heat. So yes, medieval women were seen as both morally fragile and biologically insatiable. A terrible combination, if you're trying to justify unequal power structures. Medical texts from this time rarely acknowledged female pleasure. When they did, it was usually by accident, like when explaining how to produce a male heir. Some authors admitted that a woman must reach delight to conceive, but they never lingered too long on the details. Too scandalous, too disruptive. Also, probably because none of them asked actual women. Of course, that didn't stop male doctors from offering long, detailed advice on how women should behave in bed. One treatise even warned husbands not to allow their wives to mount them, for fear it would corrupt the natural hierarchy, and possibly dislodge a spleen, though that part's still debated. Still, there were exceptions. In rare cases, especially among educated women in religious orders, female medical voices broke through. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and healer, wrote extensively on women's health, describing female anatomy and sexual function in surprisingly clear language. Her work included herbal remedies for everything from menstrual cramps to excessive yearning. Some of her treatments are still studied today. Meanwhile, everyday people relied on midwives, herbalists, and oral tradition. These healers might not have worn robes or carried scrolls, but they understood the body, how certain plants eased pain, how particular positions helped labor, how rhythm and rest mattered. They didn't write it down, but they knew. And then, of course, there were the charlatans, wandering salesmen hawking bottled lightning and Venus wine. One popular aphrodisiac combined saffron, cinnamon, and beetroot with a dash of powdered deer heart. Others used mandrake root, rumored to scream when pulled from the earth, and known to cause hallucinations. Love potions, mood elixirs, fertility charm salts sold with promises and a smile. Results not guaranteed. Imagine yourself back in your cottage, the fire low, your partner beside you. A village healer gave you a pouch of dried herbs to warm the blood. It smells like thyme and something spicier. You sip it in silence, feeling the day's aches dissolve. Outside, the wind howls against the shutters. Inside, there's a closeness that doesn't need permission or diagrams or charts, just presence. In a world where so much was misunderstood, where the womb wandered, humors argued, and testicles got boiled somehow, people still found ways to connect, to comfort, to care. Maybe that's the greatest medicine of all. You've made it this far through the haylofts, herbs, and heresy, but now it's time to trade the mud-caked boots of the peasant for the velvet slippers of the elite. Tonight, you're not sleeping in a shared barn with livestock and in-laws. No, tonight, you're in the private chambers of the highborn. And there, intimacy was a whole different game. Because if you think ordinary folks had it complicated, just wait until you see what royal sex lives looked like, especially when privacy didn't exist. Mainstream historical fact: royalty, despite all their wealth and power, lived lives that were astonishingly public. The idea of a private, secluded bedroom was practically unheard of. From birth to death, from bath to bed, everything was ceremonial. So yes, that included consummating the marriage, and if you were a royal, there might be an audience for it. Let's say you're a young princess, barely 16, married off to a foreign prince you've spoken to twice. You arrive at court in a carriage filled with lavender sachets and whispered instructions. You're led into a room that's been decorated for the occasion. Rose petals scattered, bed curtains drawn back, candles lit, and nobles waiting outside. You and your husband are to be put to bed literally by senior courtiers. They'll escort you into the chamber, undress you both, bless the bed, and sometimes even witness the first part of consummation to ensure the union is legally and spiritually binding. Romantic, isn't it? Historians still argue how often this ceremonial witnessing actually involved watching the act itself, or just observing the couple get into bed. But documented accounts from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire suggest it sometimes went beyond just curtain closing. There are records of queens who were expected to produce evidence of consummation blood on linen, a midwife's report, or even a formal statement signed by attendants. If the bedding was disputed or incomplete, the marriage could be annulled. No pressure, really. And then there's the politics of heirs. A royal marriage wasn't just about love if. Love was even part of it. It was about alliance, land, legitimacy. Producing an heir was urgent, and failure could lead to exile, annulment, or worse. If a queen didn't conceive quickly enough, her womb became a matter of state. Midwives were summoned, astrologers consulted, and yes, physicians examined the royal couple's habits, including what time of day they did it, and in what position. There's a letter from an English bishop recommending early morning intercourse for fertility, but only after fasting and prayer, because nothing spices up romance like an empty stomach and church bells. Quirky tidbit: some kings believed in sexual omens. Charles VI of France reportedly blamed a headache after intimacy for a bad battlefield decision. Others avoided sex entirely before major political meetings, fearing it would drain their vital essence. Meanwhile, some queens were prescribed bedroom tonics made from crushed pearls and unicorn horn. Spoiler: the unicorn horn was really narwhal tusk, and it did absolutely nothing. Life at court was filled with spies, rumours, and scandals. A glance exchanged at a banquet could become a full-blown affair in court gossip. Servant Sever, present in royal chamber, overheard everything. Maids who helped undress the queen knew when her cycle began and ended. Squires who poured wine for the king noticed, who lingered near his private chambers. Privacy was an illusion, and intimacy, no matter how tender or sincere, often had political consequences. Take Catherine of Valois, widow of King Henry V. She fell in love with a Welsh clerk named Owen Tudorfar below her station. They married in secret, had children, including the grandfather of Henry VII, and caused a royal scandal so large that laws were passed to prevent dowager queens from marrying without permission. Love blossomed, but only in hiding. Or consider the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry III, royal couple whose passions were as famous as their arguments. Their frequent quarrels, separations, and reconciliations became part of royal law. Eleanor was eventually imprisoned for supporting her sons in rebellion. Her dangerous independence and charisma were seen as threats to the crown. Sexual chemistry? Maybe. Political volatility? Absolutely. Even the church had opinions on royal intimacy. Popes weighed in on who could marry whom, whether a union was valid, and if a child was legitimate. They could invalidate marriages, demand separations, and even annul entire bloodlines. The royal bedroom, in many ways, was just another battleground in the ongoing war between crown and cross. And yet, behind the layers of ritual and scrutiny, there are glimpses of genuine tenderness. Letters between royal spouses reveal affection, longing, and humour. Henry VIII, before he became famously homicidal, wrote passionate love notes to Anne Boleyn. Some were filled with jealousy, others with clumsy metaphors, all preserved in the Vatican archives after being stolen by spies. Because of course they were. Meanwhile, queens kept journals, some private, some intended for posterity, describing their marriages with a mix of hope and resignation. A 14th century Castilian queen wrote, "He is kind to me at supper and silent in the dark. I think this is love, or something like it. It's not Shakespeare, but it's honest." And then there's the furniture. Royal beds were massive, not just in size, but in symbolism. They were often ornately carved, embroidered with family crests, sometimes elevated on platforms and surrounded by thick curtains. Not just a place to sleep, but a stage for power, inheritance, and the occasional midnight visitor. There's a famous bed in England called the Great Bed of Ware, over 10 feet wide, which may have hosted dozens of people at once, no necessarily at the same time, but you never know. Now picture yourself as a court servant. You light the hearth in the royal chamber, fluff the pillows, scatter lavender. Then you retreat behind the velvet curtain as your king and queen enter. You're not supposed to listen, but the stone walls echo. A whisper, a sigh, the rustle of silk. You try to ignore it, focus on folding linens, but in the hush of that vast chamber, even secrets feel loud. Royalty lived their lives in performance, and yet, beneath the layers of expectation, protocol, and watching eyes, they too were human, awkward, yearning, sometimes in love, often in duty, caught between dynasty and desire. So as you settle under your own covers tonight, spare a thought for the king who couldn't sleep for fear of failure, for the queen who whispered love poems to a servant she could never touch, for the couple forced into bed together before a crowd, holding hands in the dark, trying to find something real in the silence. Now, at last, you reach the quiet place where the candle has nearly burned itself out, and all the stories, the whispered ones, the scandalous ones, the ones embroidered in silk and sewn into the hems of peasant skirt shave, finally softened into a single thread. Because behind the rules, rituals, church decrees, and uncomfortable hay mattresses, there is something that never really changed: love, lust, and the human thread that wove through it all. Mainstream historical fact. For all its rigid structure, medieval society was held together by human relationships, familial, romantic, platonic, and everything in between. You could change your class, your title, even your name, but you could not escape your need for connection. No law, no doctrine, no social code ever managed to erase that most persistent force, the desire to be seen and wanted. You, perhaps, are not a noble or a peasant tonight. Maybe you're just someone standing in the middle of the market square at dusk. All around you are the signs of medieval life bakers closing shop, pigeons picking at crumbs, a child chasing a dog through the straw, and amid it all, people exchanging glances. That's how most things began. Not with contracts or poems, but with eye contact, laughter, shared labour, two shepherds watching over flocks, two girls spinning flax in the same corner of a drafty hall, a merchant who returns to the same spice stall every week for no clear reason. Sometimes you didn't even have to touch to feel it. There were rules. Yes, and dangers. So many dangers. But also a kind of wonder. In a world where illness swept through in waves, where hunger knocked at doors every winter, where childbirth could claim a life as swiftly as war, love was not frivolous. It was a rebellion, a gamble, a reminder that you were still alive. And lust, though feared, punished, twisted into tales of sin, and punishment was also, undeniably, a force of nature. You can see it in medieval art, even where it wasn't meant to be. Marginalia doodled by bored monks, rabbits kissing, nuns embracing, men being chased by phallic snails. Supposedly devout texts that wander suddenly into detailed metaphors about vines intertwining and sweet fruits of the flesh. The rules were strict, but imagination had no master. Quirky tidbit. In the 15th century, a book of moral guidance for young women cautioned them not to laugh too freely, as it might inflame male passions. The very idea that laughter could be dangerous says everything you need to know about how much desire scared people, not just in others but in themselves. Historians still argue whether medieval people thought about love the same way we do now. Certainly, they lacked some of our languagino psychology, No love languages, no therapy terms, but the letters, the poems, the graffiti carved into monastery walls suggests something startlingly familiar. One carving, found deep in a ruined Scottish chapel, simply says, "She was here. I loved her. I still do." They loved in spite of the odds. Lovers walked for days to exchange a message. Brides sent tiny embroidered favors across battlefields. A knight wore his beloved's scarf on the edge of a blade. A serving boy sang a song he'd written for the cooper's daughter, even though her father never let her leave the house. And sometimes, yes, they failed. They lost each other. They married someone else. But even the losing had meaning. You think of the woman whose husband never returned from war, who kept his boots by the door for years. Or the two men who built a home together in a quiet village, calling themselves brothers, and no one asking too many questions. You imagine a widow who buried 3 children and still sat by the fire each night, brushing her hair and remembering a kiss in the rain 40 years ago. These weren't legends, these were people. Real, messy, flawed, and full of yearning. Even the saints weren't safe from longing. Medieval hagiographies, those dramatic stories of holy lives, are filled with ecstatic language. Saints who burned with divine love, who spoke of God entering them, whose visions teetered on the edge of romantic obsession. Scholars still debate whether this was metaphor or suppressed sexuality, or something else entirely. But either way, it speaks to how deeply humans longed to be touched physically, spiritually, emotionally. And so, as the medieval world slowly shifted toward the Renaissance, new ideas began to trickle in. The old rigidities cracked. Poetry became bolder. Love stories became less about noble sacrifice and more about personal connection. Even the church began to concede that maybe, just maybe, love had a place in marriage, not as a bonus, but as a foundation. But long before any of that, the people of the Middle Ages were already finding their own paths. They weren't waiting for permission. They were carving hearts into trees. They were slipping herbs into soup. They were writing shaky verses in the margins of prayer books. They were lying side by side, hands clasped, and dreaming of something warmer than obligation. So you, lying here now, in a soft bed centuries removed from straw and cold stone, may feel far away from those people. But you're not. The ache that curls in your chest when you miss someone, the way your heart stumbles when you're seen, the safety of falling asleep beside someone who cares, that's the same thread that ran through every hayloft, chapel, and castle chamber. It connects you to them, not through blood, but through longing. You sigh in the dark. The past settles around you like an old wool cloak. Somewhere, a church bell tolls midnight. You don't need a moral tonight. No tidy lesson. Just the quiet truth that we've always searched for love, feared its power, and chosen it anyway. And now, as the candle fades into its final flicker, let the noise of medieval streets and whispered prayers fall away. No more courtships or bed inspections. No more strange remedies or scandalous glances. Just quiet. Just the hush that follows a long, long story. Breathe slowly. Let your body soften into the bed. Feel the gentle weight of stillness settle over your shoulders. Imagine a cobblestone path, empty now under moonlight. The day's labor is done. The lovers have all gone home. The scrolls are rolled, the windows shuttered. Only the stars remain watching, distant and ancient, as they've always been. You are one thread in a very old tapestry, woven together with countless others, stitched with laughter, longing, and late-night conversations. Let your breath move in and out like the rhythm of a distant lute. Let your thoughts drift to simpler moments, holding hands in secret, laughing over spilled ale, a shared blanket in winter. Let it all grow quieter, slower, softer, nothing more to understand, nothing to fix, just the peaceful, timeless truth that love has always been there, awkward, tender, defiant, and real. Sleep well now. The past is resting too,